The next 10 minutes or so are not going to be comfortable, because we're going to spend some time now dwelling on the worst of humanity, the absolute dregs of them. The Israeli Defence Force has put together a 45-minute film. They showed this film to the world leaders at the World Economic Forum recently. It's a bunch of footage of the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October last year. Footage that was gathered first from first responders to the attacks and the aftermath of the carnage, and footage from the terrorists themselves who recorded it while they did it and then posted it online. It's an appalling photographic record of the brutal massacre of 1,400 Israeli citizens, including mass abuse, tortures, bonding and burning of toddlers, beheadings, and live mutilations. Upon seeing it, people walked out of the room in silence, simply crying or shell-shocked. After the screening, theologian David Miller was asked to close the event. This is what he said. "What we've just witnessed adds to feelings of helplessness, anger, fear, outrage, and pain. Frankly, I have no idea how to stop this, fix this, or find a way to end the pain in the horrific, barbaric, inhuman things that we just saw." What he's saying here is very true, isn't it? Something we all know is true, right? Because we all know it's beyond us to fix something like that. Apart from the emotional damage, how can justice be done? What would be a satisfactory punishment for those Hamas terrorists? Or any other dregs of humanity who perpetrate atrocities like this? Would catching them and throwing them in jail for the rest of their lives fix the pain and the grief of a mother whose child has been brutalised and murdered? Of course not. Would it turn back a woman being abused or a husband being decapitated? Of course not. A life sentence is too good for them. Some might even say the death sentence is too good for them. So what's good enough? Well, clearly no human punishment. There is no human punishment that would ever be enough for such heinous evil. So where is it going to come from? This justice, this punishment? God? Because if we're going to invoke God to cry out to heaven for justice, then you know what we're also crying out for? We're crying out for hell. We all know there are deeds that demand not only condemnation, but damnation. No one, at least emotionally, would deny that Hitler deserves hell, for instance. The wartime English Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he once said this: "The evidence that God exists was the existence of Lenin and Trotsky," and maybe we'd add Hitler and Hamas, "for whom a hell is needed." But let's not be so naive to think that we'd be any better than those Hamas terrorists. If we'd been born into the family, the neighbourhood, the society, the country that those Hamas terrorists were born into, would we be any different? Would we not have also been capable and just as likely to have participated in those attacks on the 7th of October last year as they were? I'm sure we'd hope to think that we wouldn't have, but it'd be naive. It'd be naive to say that we couldn't have. Because we're of the same species as them. How we express our evil may be to a much lesser degree and mollified by the culture and the expectations and the circumstances and families that we grew up in, but our evil is of the same kind. Given the same set of ingredients that went into making up their lives, we'd be just the same. We are just the same. Just in less atrocious, less obvious ways. Now, for instance, who hasn't wished someone dead? Even if only in their head. And even fantasised maybe about getting revenge on someone, perhaps even torturing them in some way or another. The natural trajectory from those kind of thoughts, you know where it ends? In the terrorism on October the 7th last year. So it seems those dregs of humanity, they're actually all of us. And so at the end of the day, the only satisfying justice and judgment for all our evil, the only right punishment for our personal evil, small or great, can only and must only come from God, which leaves us in a rather uncomfortable position, deserving hell, which the Bible describes as eternal conscious torment. That's what the evil inside us and what we've done with it deserves. Hell. It's what we all deserve. You deserve it. I deserve it. But incredibly, over 2,000 years ago, Jesus took it for us on that bloody, violent, horrific Friday when he drank to the dregs for the dregs of humanity, which is powerfully pictured in the final moments of the crucifixion that we just read in the Gospel of John, where he asks for a drink and he gets given the dregs. We read it earlier. Later, knowing that everything had now been fulfilled and so that Scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. I'm thirsty. Now, throughout the book, the Gospel of John, this book, the author, John, the Apostle John, he's gone to great lengths to show how Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, how they all fulfill prophecies and writings in the Jewish Scriptures about the promised Messiah from hundreds of years before. You know, like the soldiers casting lots for his clothing, mentioned just a few sentences earlier in this chapter, in chapter 19. And Jesus knew he was doing this. He knew he was fulfilling what the Scriptures said about the Messiah. And he was doing this willingly, even though it got him wrongfully accused, abandoned by all his friends, tortured, mocked, maimed, stripped of his clothes, stripped of his flesh, stripped of his humanity as he's pinned like an insect onto that cross. As he endured all this, Jesus knew he was fulfilling what the Scriptures said must happen to the Messiah, to the one who would suffer to save God's people. Now, earlier in his crucifixion, we're told they offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, which was a mild sedative. But Jesus refuses it. Here, however, he actually asks for a drink, not a sedative, but actually something to quench his thirst. It's not to dull the pain, it's to increase it, as he's offered wine vinegar. Firstly, because wine won't quench his thirst, it'll only increase it. Vinegar wine all the more so. And on top of that, any drink is going to prolong his life, and so prolong his pain. And he knows this, and he knows that it had to be this way. Just hours earlier, he prays, and as he's arrested, Jesus talks about what he's about to suffer as a cup from God. Now, often in the Old Testament, the Jewish Scriptures, the cup of the Lord is a reference to God's judgment and wrath, like in Psalm 75, where we read, "It is God who judges. In the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs." And in the prophet Isaiah, who says, God says through him, "You who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath." And Jesus knew, even though he wasn't one of the wicked, that he didn't deserve to drink this cup. He knew, as the promised Messiah, he was to drink to the dregs the cup of God's judgment for others, as the prophet Isaiah elsewhere anticipates hundreds of years beforehand about the Messiah, where he writes this of the Messiah: "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." Jesus fulfills this prophecy as he willingly went to the cross to suffer for our transgressions, for our iniquities. Now, those are just fancy words for screw-ups, for the ways that we have selfishly served ourselves over others, for the way that we've ignored our conscience and been people pleasers, for the way that we've done and said dumb, selfish, let's just call it for what it is, evil things. For the evil we've done, the evil we've thought, the evil we've said, for the Hamas terrorist in each of us. For this, Jesus willingly suffered God's punishment on that cross, the punishment we deserved for the evil we've done, said or thought, big or small. Jesus took that for us to bring us peace with God. And not just for us, for the whole world. He drank to the dregs the cup of God's wrath for the evil of the whole world. And Jesus, he wants to make this very clear that that's precisely what he's doing while in agony on that cross. So he looks to prolong it. He asks for a drink. A drink from a jar that's full of wine vinegar. And he suffers drinking from a sponge that's full of the vinegar wine. As if that's the cup of God's righteous anger, full to the brim of our evil. Jesus takes that cup and he gulps it down. Gulp by agonizing gulp. Down to the dregs. Till it's done. Till it's dusted. Finished. And so we read, when he'd received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." And with that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The price for our evil is death and God's eternal punishment. That's hell. And Jesus, as God the Son, as eternal and perfect, he suffers the eternal debt of hell, God's righteous punishment. He pays for it with his perfect life. And at that moment, as he gave up his spirit, we know at least two things. Firstly, justice is done. The punishment we deserve for the evil we've thought, said and done, that's entirely and utterly satisfied by Jesus. If you accept this, God's not angry at you. You're not only forgiven by him, you are right in his eyes. You stand justified before him, just as if you'd never done or said or thought anything wrong, just as if you'd never been evil, just as if that little terrorist in you was never there. The sentence of death and hell no longer hangs over your head. You don't need to fear death. You don't need to fear God. You're free. The cup of God's wrath is no longer yours to drink because Jesus has drunk it to the dregs for you. It is finished. That's the first thing. Second thing, as those who trust in Jesus, the wrong things, the evil things that we continue to do or say or think, they're actually worse than we think. They're the reason Jesus drank to the dregs the cup of God's wrath the way that he did on that cross. They deserved that kind of response from God. That's how appalling, how offensive, how nauseating they are. So knowing this, knowing that Jesus drank to the dregs what we deserve for the wrong we've done, said and thought, why on earth would we go on doing, saying and thinking such evil things? Why would we give that little terrorist in us any ammunition? Surely for the love of Jesus, we'd want to beg God to help us fight against those urges and desires to do things our own way and not God's way. Surely we want to listen to our consciences as God pricks them and to work hard at making choices for Jesus that might cost us. And to do this every day of our lives, to love him because he loved us, to drink deeply of him and his ways because, well, he drank to the dregs the cup of God's wrath for us. And so I thought we could do something together now to reflect on Jesus drinking the dregs of God's wrath for us so that we might love him more for it, by doing a little bit of drinking ourselves. Drinking of those bottles that are on your seat. Grab one. Open it up. And we're going to drink it down. Don't be polite about it. Gulp it down. And as you do that, remember that Jesus gulped down Jesus' punishment for us. And with each gulp, remember what he suffered for us. And as you finish gulping your drink down and you come up for air, you know what we're going to say out loud together? Perhaps to the person next to you, it is finished. Don't wait till the person next to you is finished. Just gulp it down, breathe and say, it is finished. So, grab your bottle and let's get to it. It is finished. It's finished. We're going to sing our final song, reflecting on that reality.